Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. I want to thank you all for joining me for our Tuesday Treasure program. This is where we highlight different items from the collection. So tonight, I, again, also want to welcome you. My name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education here at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. Tonight we are highlighting some of the items that were focused on in our exhibition called Remembered. I apologize, I think something was wrong with my sound. There we go. So the items that we're going to focus on are items that were highlighted in our Remembered exhibition, which was on view from May of 2018 to June of 2019. As usual, I want to thank you all for your support of the museum. If you do feel so inclined and are able to at this difficult time, we do ask that you donate to the museum. We do have a suggested donation of $5, but we also encourage you to support the museum through following us on our social media accounts. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. So do give us a follow and a like on those platforms, and you will be notified every time that we are holding a program such as this tonight. During our program, if you do have any questions, feel free to enter them in the comment box. I will go through as many of them as I can at the end of our program tonight. And if you don't get the chance to enter a question while we are live this evening, you can always go back and put one in. And my team and I are always monitoring these videos to see if there are any new questions or comments. So please do feel free to do that and interact with us as you wish. So tonight, before we actually jump into our objects, all of our objects this evening are also archival objects, so I will do my best to show you them. Some of them are quite old, which you will see, so they are very fragile. So I will try to give you the best view that you can of these items. And do let me know if you cannot see. I will try to show them in detail. But before we jump into these archival items, I wanted to give you a bit of a brief history of the period of time that we're speaking about. So we are starting our history of African Americans in Westport all the way back in the 17th century. The first black people that are here in Connecticut are enslaved, and the first enslaved people that we know of in Connecticut are in the mid-1600s, the mid-17th century. And they are mostly here to foster the agricultural movement that's happening in New England. A lot of these farms that are sprouting up and a lot of the agriculture that is being supported here is being, a lot of that work is being done by enslaved peoples. We know that there are at least, well, it's estimated to be around 6,500 enslaved people in Connecticut, and that is the most enslaved people in any New England state. Here in Westport, between 1742 and 1822, we are very fortunate to have church records from Green's Farms, the parish records of births, marriages, deaths, and baptisms. And between those 80 years, and that 80-year period, we have documented over 240 individuals, and this includes men, women, and children, all who were enslaved in just that parish. That sounds like a fairly large number, especially over 80 years, 240, but that is just in one parish of Westport. So it is hard to tell exactly how large that number is in Westport, especially over those 80 years, because we just don't have the records in all of the parishes. So it is a large number that is most likely much larger, but it is very hard to determine. During this period, as we move a bit forward in time, up to the time of the Revolution, slavery is a topic that's on a lot of minds. There are many people who are advocating for freedom for enslaved people. There is the discussion of, obviously, many of the revolutionaries are seeing the parallels between themselves and enslaved peoples, but it is not something that Connecticut jumps on board with. Again, Connecticut is the highest owner of slaves in the New England states. And unfortunately, we see them as the last New England state to actually enact abolition and actually emancipate slavery and outlaw slavery. Connecticut does pass the Gradual Abolition Act in 1784, but this act doesn't actually emancipate enslaved persons. It only emancipates people who are born into slavery and only after they reach the age of 25. So we see that in 1784, but we don't actually see it outlawed until 1848. And there are many states who do that before. We have Vermont that does it in 1777, Massachusetts and New Hampshire in 1783, and then New York in 1827. And again, Connecticut is 1848. So it's something that happens very, very slowly in Connecticut. It's also significant to point out that Connecticut enforced the fugitive slave laws, which meant that if an enslaved person escaped their masters in the South, it was very unfortunate that if they were caught in a free state in the North, they would be returned to the South. And this is something that Connecticut did enforce and complied with. And many, not many, but some other northern states would actually be less likely to enforce this, but that's not the case for Connecticut. So how do we know all of these things? I did mention the Greens Farms Records book, which tracks births, deaths, baptisms, and marriages. But we also know this through other records that were kept by town clerks as legal documents and other town entities where we find these documents. Some of them are wills, other are probate registers or probate lists, and they were really legal documents. They were receipts in a way, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them specifically as we jump into our documents here. So the first piece that I thought we would look at, and I am going to point my camera down. So again, do let me know. I am looking at our comments. Do let me know if you can see these documents well enough. Some of them are in sleeves, so they may have a bit of glare, but I will try to give you a good view. So this is our first document this evening, and this is a payment list. On the back of this document, we do have an address. Again, you won't see it. It's just on the back. And it is addressed to Dr. John Hyde from a John Allen, and this is dated November 23rd, 1744. So this is just prior to the Revolution. This is about 30 years prior. And this is a list of services that Dr. John Hyde, you can actually see the date up here at the top. I do hope you can see this a bit. He has very, very small handwriting, very, very fine handwriting, but up here at the top it actually lists 1740, and then as we progress down the list, it goes to 1744. Down here we have an entry for October. The entry that we are interested in, first of all, is the entry here. And in case you can't read it, it is very illegible. We can't make out the entire line, but we do know that the date is September 8th, and it says, to Negro we can't make out this word just yet, but it is some kind of either possibly a treatment or possibly some kind of payment for work that was done. Again, because this is a doctor and we see most of the other entries as treatments that were administered, this might be something that an enslaved person was treated for, an enslaved person who belonged to John Allen. This document is helpful to us because it shows how enslaved peoples were invested in or cared for in a way, in the sense that they were human property. In many cases, in most cases, enslaved people are considered to be on the same level as a work animal, something like that. In the same way that you would reshoe your horse, you have to treat your enslaved person for something if they're injured. It's a terrible thing to think about, and it's a terrible mindset, but it's a mindset that we as historians have to think about when we see documents such as this and when we interpret them. And I do see some of your comments that it's too far away to read, and it is. I apologize. This document is extremely small handwriting. You can see our entry just here for September. I'll hold this here for just a moment so you can see that line, and I do know that it might have a bit of glare, that it might have a bit of a hard view on that one. And it is a very illegible line, but it is noteworthy to have a record like this. The next piece, as we move forward in time, that last record is from 1744. This next piece is from 1760. This is a probate distribution. So this is, I apologize, this is a will, and this is actually a copy of a will. We have two copies of this will to different town officials who needed a copy. This is from the estate of John Hyde to his wife Abigail Hyde. Up here on the first line we can see the date of 1760. Apologize, it's just too high for you to see. And I am being very, very delicate with this piece. These are among some of our oldest documents in the museum's collection. So just up here at the top, you can see the date of 1760. You can also see John Hyde here. But down below, and I am looking at this backwards or upside down, so I do apologize. It might take me just a moment to find it. Here we are. So this line here, John Hyde is leaving the use of his Negro girl Dorcas to his beloved wife Abigail. Now the Hyde family of Hyde Lane in Westport was a slave-owning family for many generations. This Negro girl, Dorcas, as we see here, is owned by John and is given to his wife, Abigail. We also know that John's son, John Jr., bought and sold many African Americans throughout his lifetime, and we know that from other documents as well. We also know that John Hyde was the beneficiary of another Westporter, Sarah Banks. Both of them belonged to the Green Farms Church, which would have been in the area of Longlots Road. And we know that from Sarah, John inherited a Negro wench, Bet, and her child, Kate, and they were valued at 5 shillings. Now again, these documents help us get an idea of the number of individuals who were here, who were enslaved, but it also helps us understand the value that was placed on these people. Thomas Jefferson in 1820 wrote a letter, and in his letter, talking about his own plantation in Virginia of Monticello, wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man of the farm." Knowing that quote, it does help us to see documents like this, to understand the value, as I said, but also to see the value that was placed on young women in particular, because of the increased wealth that they could give their owner by producing children. Any child that was born of an enslaved woman was considered enslaved, and that they would belong to the owner of that woman, and it would increase what they would consider to be their holdings at the time. This document is also interesting for the time that it is. This is a document from 1761, just over a decade before the Revolution. We do have another document that was exhibited in our remembered display from John Hyde 4 days before the landing at Campo Beach by the British during the Revolution in 1777. 4 days before this landing, in which John Hyde promoted his support for the revolutionaries. 4 days before John Hyde supported the revolution and the freedom of the Americas, he bought what he called a Negro boy, and would continue to do so throughout the revolution and throughout his life. It does give a sense of sad irony to know that people who were fighting for their freedom from tyranny, from British rule, still considered themselves to be owners of other people. The next item here, bring that down for you just a bit. This next item is a probate inventory. And this is a probate inventory from 1787. We can see the date just here. If you can see that, I'll bring it a bit closer. Apologize. So we have the date just over here. You can see 1787. And this is a probate inventory for Reverend Samuel Sherwood. So this is an inventory of his estate, and he lists various household and farm possessions, ranging from sheets to hay to kettle, and just above his horse and oxen and sheep, which are valued at 26 pounds and 10 pence each, is a Negro man named Jack, who is valued at 65 pounds. This is just another example of these archival documents that were kept as true legal documents to be used by the town, that lists human beings as a taxable commodity. The last document from the 18th century that I wanted to show you this evening is that of Abigail Bradley. And this document I will bring a bit closer. It has some blank area on the bottom, so you can see very clearly up at the top, Abigail Bradley. Unfortunately, it is not dated, but we can tell from the quality of the paper and other clues within the document that it is most likely from the mid to late 18th century. Also, the goods that are labeled on this ledger, in a way, in a probate, gives us clues to the time period. So we're very confident in probably somewhere between 1750 and 1800 is probably when this document is from. So in several of the other documents as well, I've mentioned the idea of a probate inventory. Really, in the Connecticut colony, all personal items, an itemized list of everything you owned, was subject to tax. So these lists, again, as I mentioned, were useful to the town for tax reasons, but are useful to us to also see the inventory of an average Westporter's home. So Abigail Bradley lists worst blankets, tablecloths, earthen platters, as well as the Negro girl. It is put very plainly, without detail. There is no name, and that, unfortunately, is the case in many of these documents. We see the Negro girl or a Negro boy, with very little to tell us more about them. They're listed very much as a commodity, as something that is owned to be taxed on these documents. And you can actually see the entry again. It is difficult to read these documents sometimes, and I admit I am not the best on our staff to read these documents. They can be very, very tricky. But I believe, and I apologize, that the entry is, and I've lost it. Again, I found it because I was reading from the bottom. You can actually see the entry here. Very short. It's actually the shortest one on the page, and they actually do a dotted line over so you can see the value of 28 pounds, the Negro girl. The next piece that I have for you this evening is not a tax record or a legal document, as we have been looking at, but is actually a letter. And I do not know if you will be able to read this letter because it is written on this blue paper. Again, more of this cursive handwriting. But this is about 60 years or more, depending on which document you look at. But this is about 60 years later than Abigail's probate listing. This is a letter from 1863 on February 4th. And this is a letter that's written by Benjamin Tokay. You will, most likely, if you live in Westport, you will recognize the Tokay name from Tokay Hall, from the teen center that's down in downtown Westport. Now, Benjamin Tokay originally immigrated from France, and he later on, I believe his son, went on to found the Tokay Motor Company. The Tokay family was also responsible for the Tokay Opera Hall, or Music Hall. But this letter is written during the Civil War, when Benjamin Tokay is serving in the Union Army. And they're significant for two reasons. This letter is one in a series. One of the other letters that Tokay writes is when he's aboard a ship named Planter. And this is a former Confederate ship that actually was commandeered by its enslaved crew and captain, Robert Smalls, who take the ship out under the safety, relative safety, of darkness, and they avoid all of the sea mines that they have placed simply because they placed them and they know where they are. And they sail out of the south to the north where they give up the ship to the Union and they receive their freedom. So it's interesting that this former Confederate ship that was responsible for the freedom, or was a vehicle, if you will, for the freedom of its enslaved crew, it is made into a Union ship and keeps its name of Planter, and that is the ship that Benjamin Tokay rides down to New Orleans, where he's stationed. The other reason that this letter, I will also mention that Robert Smalls, the captain of that ship, goes on to serve in the United States government and is actually responsible for, I believe it was for the bill that introduced public education in the United States. Definitely go and learn about him a bit more. He's a fascinating subject or figure in American history. The second reason that Tokay's letters are so helpful to us in understanding this period of American history, specifically related to African Americans, is a section of the letter that he writes. This letter he writes to his wife, and I am not going to point out the entry because, again, I'm not sure that you'll be able to read it, but I am going to read a bit of his letter that I will leave out some language from, and then I will come back to you all. He writes, "B and I, being dissatisfied with our dinner, went over to Auntie's and had some excellent fritters and coffee. While dinner was cooking, I was imprudent enough to lay down on one of the numerous beds that furnished every N hut, and I slept for a half hour or so. When I got back to camp, I found myself covered with 1,000 fleas, more or less. I caught 20 at least in a search of as many minutes, and then gave up in despair, resolving never to sleep on an N-word's bed again." Something that, again, that is a direct quote from his letter, something that we as historians try to pass on to our audiences is the language that's used during a time. There are nuances that set certain periods apart from others. One thing that we have found in the installation of this exhibit and presenting that material to our audiences is also letting people know that some words were common. The word Negro and Black were used very often to describe African Americans. But the N-word specifically was meant as a derogatory and insulting and degrading word, no matter how it was used. Seeing that it's used in a Union soldier from Westport writing to his wife in a private letter tells us something about that person. We also know that Tokay enlisted in the Union Army for the pay, not necessarily for the values. We can't say for sure the attitudes and opinions of Tokay, but we can read very much into a letter such as this and the language that they use to understand some of the feelings of that time. The last item that I wanted to show you all this evening is also an archival piece, but it is not a document. This is actually a photograph. Now, this photograph, unfortunately, is not dated. We do know, I am going to hold it at an angle so you can see it a bit more clearly. From the style of the clothing and also from this collection, we have this photo dated somewhere in the late 19th century. the late 1800s. This comes from a collection of photographs donated to the museum by the Sipperley family. Unfortunately, this photo, not much is known about it. There is an inscription on the back which reads, "Colored girl burned house down accidentally." Unfortunately, we don't know the circumstances of this event. We don't know the names of any of these individuals. And unfortunately, that is the case in many of the references that we see to African Americans in much of our colonial and early history in our state, and really across the country. Just as our documents simply list an enslaved person and their value, many photographs and items that are left behind by these people just don't give us much detail, but we do love to be able to see photographs such as this, and photographs of families and people that we do know of. And we always, always, always encourage a family to mark and sign their photos, to actually label them before they donate, so that we can learn more about the individuals in photographs such as this. It's always extremely helpful in helping those stories live on. So that is the last item I have for you all this evening. I'll tip my camera back up so you can see. So I am going to go through, I do see that we have quite a few comments, so I'm going to go through all of those, as many of them as I can. I do know that it's just after 6:30 now. We do have some comments here. Ramin comments that by the Revolution, there were close to 7,000 enslaved people in Connecticut from the census, and it's most likely not accurate. There were probably more individuals, and that's just individuals in Fairfield County. So that number, again, we know of 240 individuals in the parish of Greens Farms, but that number is much higher. We just don't have the evidence. Right now, we are hoping to come across more of that evidence as more and more sources come up and that information is being shared. We are updating all of that information. And we hope to be able to give a much better idea of the number of people that were enslaved, and also the free African Americans that were living in Westport. We do know of some free African Americans as well. There was a family called the Monroes who lived in Westport for nearly 100 years. We also have record of many, not many again, but a portion of that population giving themselves the last name of Freeman, which is something that indicates to us that they may have been freed and were given that last name by themselves as an indicator of their status. Let's see, what else we have here? We do have a lot of comments. I'm probably not going to read all of the comments just because we are running a little slow on time. But Ramin also mentions the life of William Grimes. And I am going to point that out because in several weeks in July, I believe it's on the 10th, we are hosting Regina Mason, who actually wrote the life of William Grimes, who is her direct ancestor. And he writes his autobiography about basically fleeing from the South, and we are hosting her to discuss the process of writing her book, and she also created a documentary about finding her ancestor and his life. So we do encourage you to join us on July 10th to listen with Miss Mason about her relative of William Grimes. It's a really fascinating story. There is a comment or a question, kind of a comment, of our first document from Dr. John Hyde from Sarah. It does say something about blood on that record. Actually, if I bring it back here. So John Hyde is a doctor. This is that very first document we looked at, the receipt of payment. We are hoping to look at that document a bit closer, be able to look at some of the other entries on this list and decipher what that says. We just aren't sure what it says at this moment. Again, it's not known whether it was a treatment or something else, but most likely something to do with treatment of an ailment or an injury of some kind. Ramin also points out that Dorcas Hyde, who was mentioned in one of our documents, is buried at the Greens Farms Lower Cemetery right next to the Sherwood Island connector. That is a cemetery that we do a tour on, usually in the fall, and we do like to point out Dorcas's headstone. She is also buried next to Lizette Hyde Monroe, who's also that Monroe family that I mentioned, that they live in Westport for over 100 years as free people. And it's not known what their relationship is, possibly daughter, possibly sisters, but it's an interesting connection. We have a lot of comments on here as well. Reverend Sherwood, who we looked at his probate listing, is of the family whose holding became Sherwood Island and the Mill Pond. We actually, a few weeks ago, we released some exclusive content for Westport is Our Oyster on the history of oystering, and the Mill Pond, we know it was most likely managed or at least had workers who were enslaved there, who were tending the mill. And we know, actually, we do know, that's a very good point in that comment, we do know that the corn and the wheat that it was ground at that mill was exported, and that it was exported to the West Indies. When a commodity is traded to the West Indies, it is usually, at least in food trade, it is usually to feed enslaved peoples. The food that is produced in the West Indies and the sugar cane is not meant to feed the population there. Actually, when you see trade embargoes that are put in place during the Revolution and just after on the West Indies, we see enslaved people die in those areas at a huge rate because the food isn't able to be imported. We also have another comment here about Robert Smalls, the captain of the Planter who I mentioned, and they say he went on to be the equivalent of a naval admiral. He is a really, really interesting character. He served as a senator. He's really a person to look at more closely. I will also mention that the museum is, at the moment right now, is putting together a virtual rendition of Remembered, which will include all of the documents I've shown tonight, as well as many, many, many more resources that we used in that exhibit. It will include all of the content that we presented, as well as other resources across the state and the country to look at, to understand this history a little bit better. And that virtual exhibit will span time from African Americans, at that point, Africans coming into the Connecticut colony, again, when we started in the 17th century, all the way up through current times today. So that will cover all of Westport's history, at least in terms of this specific topic. Sarah also comments that the Tokay family had black servants in their home as late as the 1920s, and we can see this in census data. That is also a great point, that even though Connecticut passed their emancipation in 1848, that they completely outlawed slavery, that doesn't mean that the black population left. Many of the people who were enslaved and who were freed stayed in the area to work for families. They may have, we do know that many of them moved out of this community. It was not a community that they felt welcome in. Connecticut was not a welcome state to fugitive slaves and later to freed enslaved people. But it is important to note that they were still here in the community. They didn't disappear. They were definitely an active part of society. Ramin also comments here that slave deeds and emancipation records are other legal documents that we look at. And she also notes that they're often the only way that we can uncover the lives of African American peoples from the 17th and 18th century in this area. Again, the documents that we looked at tonight list them very briefly, but it really might be the only source that we have to know anything about these individuals. There's also a comment here, which is a very good comment. The 240 individuals that we identified from the Greens Farms Parish Registry book, we honored them in the exhibit while it was still up with a wall of names, as a memorial wall. Any of the names that were listed there were put on this wall as a representation of these people. Dorcas appears on that wall. There's also Kate and her child Kate that we saw in one of our records. These names were all installed, and you can see them today, right now, in our brick walk outside. If you actually go to the museum's grounds, you can see the brick walk just underneath our tree. There's actually a pathway from our gate. You will see all of the names of Westport's known at this point, all of the names of the enslaved individuals, as well as free individuals as well. There are about 20 or just over 20 free black people as well in that brick walk. So that is all of the questions and the comments that I see here tonight. Again, if you think of any more later on, feel free to enter them below. The virtual exhibit that I mentioned, that's going to be available on our site, virtualhistorywestport.org. That exhibit will also include interactive elements where you can leave your own thoughts and reflections and some of your comments. So we do encourage you to take a look at that as well if you would like more information, but also if you would like to interact with this information a bit more. So I want to thank you for joining me this evening. This is very important history that we're all made aware of, and we do, of course, encourage you to learn more. There are many resources online, and we, of course, are working on getting our own resources out there for you all to view. So I thank you so much. I do hope that you'll join me next week for our Tuesday Treasure, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.